to us, right? Like they may not write the equation for you and then you pick out the pieces. So they're going to tell us some tricks on how you can find your A or your B or your H or your K if it's not given to you so that you can write the equation. Now remember, this is the form in which our equations typically are going to be written for sine and cosine. So you should always have your A value at the very beginning of the equation, right? And then it'll say sine or cosine. Right after that is where the B value goes in the equation. And then if you have a horizontal shift, so if you do move left or right, that's going to be inside of some parentheses with X. If it's not inside of parentheses, then it is not a left or right shift. Okay? And then finally, on the end, you'll have a plus or minus K if you shifted up or down any. Okay, so now for some tricks on how we can find these things if it's not given to us in the question. So it says in order to find the amplitude, you would take the maximum and the minimum and divide it by 2. It does say the absolute value here because remember our amplitude is always positive. The negative reflects our graph, right? So we always are looking for a positive number for the amplitude. If we have a negative in there, that has to do with reflection, not how high or how low we're going to go, okay? So if I were to give you a graph, okay, where let's say this was a point up here at positive 2, and then we have a point down here at negative 2. So our graph looks something like this, let's say, okay? Then I know that my amplitude is 2, just based on this picture, right? But if it were harder numbers, then we could use this formula. So let's show us how the formula works here. So my maximums would be these points, right? The highest it went would be up here at 2. My minimum is this point down low down here, right? Which is at negative 2. So if I were to take these values and plug it in here, I'd have the absolute value of my maximum, which is 2, minus my minimum, which was what? Negative 2. Okay, all over 2. All right, so order of operations says I want to take care of what's up here in the top first, right? So minus a negative really means what? Plus. So this is really 2 plus 2 in the top. Okay, so this would be equivalent to, good, because we'd have 4 over 2, which is going to simplify to 2. And the absolute value of 2 is 2, right? It doesn't change its sign. Okay. All right, then it says for the axis of the wave. Okay, so whenever they are talking about the axis of the wave, they're talking about my line, right, that I would draw. Okay, it says that is y equals your maximum minus your amplitude. Okay, well, for this picture right here, that would be y equals, what was our maximum? 2. And what did we find our amplitude to be? 2. And 2 minus 2 is 0, which would make sense because if I look at my graph, right through the middle, my horizontal line y is at 0. Okay? Remember, that only changes if I shift up or down some amount. Okay? Then we have our vertical shift. So vertical shift is the location of the axis of the wave relative to the x-axis. Okay? Also, not going to change, right? Both of these are on 0 because I didn't transfer my graph anywhere else. Okay, then it says to find b, which we've already kind of been doing this, is take 2 pi and divide it by b to get your period. Or if you are looking for b, we could just manipulate this equation. So if I wanted to get b out of the bottom of this fraction, what would I do? Right, I'd multiply both sides by b, right? And then those would divide out. and then I'd have 2 pi equals the period times b. And if I'm trying to get b by itself, then what would I do? Divide by the period, right? I'm trying to get b by itself, then I divide by what I want to get rid of. So it turns out b is equal to 2 pi over the period. So depending on which one you're looking for, you take 2 pi and divide it by the one you know. So if you know the period, divide 2 pi by your period. If you know b, divide 2 pi by b, and it'll tell you the period. So same formula regardless of which one you're looking for, b or the period. Okay? Then it says for horizontal shifts for the sine graph, find where the graph first crosses the axis of the wave and then determine if sine of theta is positive or negative. So they're saying you need to figure out your lines, right, if you've shifted vertically or horizontally before you decide if your a value needs a negative in front of it. Okay, so you need to draw in those lines first. Horizontal shifts for your cosine graph say find the location of the first maximum. So in this picture I drew up here, they would want us to find that point because that was the first maximum we would come across. Okay? All right, so keeping all that information in mind, let's flip it over onto the back. So this first one says write the equation for each of the following graphs for terms of sine of theta and cosine. So we don't know if it's sine or cosine. We're going to write an equation for either one. The graphs look pretty much the same, right? It's just been shifted one way or the other if it's sine versus cosine. Okay, so there's some things that we need to find if we are going to write an equation. Well, luckily they already went and drew in this line for us. All right, and how much did they shift that line up? Does it appear? Okay, so if this is 1, then that line is at 2. Okay. All right, so I have shifted up 2, or in other words, my k value is a positive 2. Okay? All right, now remember, for all of our points, we typically, if we started at 0, 0, for sine, it would go from 0, 0 to pi halves 1, right? So we only would go up 1. So if this is my new 0, 0, for the next point, I should only go up 1 line. But it looks like for the next point, they went up, that might not even be the next point. Looks like the next time there's an actual point is up here at the top, right? Okay. So how many lines did they go up to get from the first point that I drew right here to this point? 3 lines. Okay. So that means that they must have done what to that y value of 1? What did they multiply it by if they wanted to go up 3? Right. So that must mean that our a value is 3. All right. And remember, we also can mathematically prove that as well using this or the absolute value formula. So remember, you guys said this was 2, so this would be 3, 4, 5 would be where this maximum is. And then this down here would be at -1. So I also could have done 5 minus -1, but like you guys said earlier, that really means plus, over 2. And 5 plus 1 is 6. 6 divided by 2 would give me 3. So either I count it on the graph or I can use that mathematical formula that they told us about on the front. Okay? Either way, I get 3. Okay? Now, something else that I need to check and see if my graph has is a b value. Now, remember, my b value is going to come from the period of the graph. So remember, to find b, you take the normal period, which is 2 pi, and you divide it by the period of your graph. Okay, and remember, we said that a period is how long it takes for you to complete one full cycle of your graph, right? Okay, so looks like from the 0, if I was going to go from 0 to a 0, then the next one would be all the way over here. Or if I'm going from a maximum to a maximum, I'm going from here to here. Either way, it's the same amount of lines. Okay. All right. So let's see, how many lines is it from one point to the next? How many lines is it between either those 2 blue dots or the 2 red dots? Either one. 8. Okay, so that must be my period then, right? 8 is the length of this cycle. So then I'm going to come over here and divide this by 8. Okay. So I need to simplify that, right? What would 2 pi over 8 simplify to? Pi, okay, so this would become pi fourths. So my b value is pi fourths. All right, so we found A, we found B, we found K. The only other thing we would need is H, right? Okay, now this part will vary depending on if I'm talking about sine or cosine, because those graphs start at different places, right? Okay, so let's talk about for sine. Sine's value of H. Okay, we said sine normally starts at the point what? 0, 0. Okay, but I already colored that point in red, or that's this point that I'm highlighting right here, right? So it looks like they moved over one line to make that happen. So if they move over one line to the right, then my sign for H would be X. What do I put in the parentheses if I'm moving to the right? Minus. All right, so -1. Okay? All right. But for my cosine, when I'm looking for H for cosine, remember that one is going to be this point up here in blue where I circled it and put a 5 above it, because cosine starts at a maximum, right? Okay, and it normally is at 0, 0. But it would appear that it scooted over a little bit, as well, right? Normally it would have been right here at 1, and it scooted over some as well. How many lines did it scoot over? 3. Right, 1, 2, 3 lines over. And it also went to the right, so I'm going to put a minus in this one as well. Okay, so now I've got A, I've got B, I've got H, I've got K, I've got everything I need to write the equations. So we're going to write one for each one. So let's write sines first. Okay, what do we always start our equation with? A. Right, amplitude. And what did we say our A value was? 3. Okay. All right, and then we said we're writing the graph of sine. So I've got sine. And then what comes after sine? What letter? B. And what was our B value? Okay, so I'm going to put pi fourths. But then I need another parenthesis to put my left and right shift in, right? And for sine, what did we say we were going to put in there? X minus 1. All right, and then on the end, that's where I would put K. And what did we say we were going to put for K? Plus 2. Perfect. You don't have to, but just a reminder that what you're doing there is multiplying. Because on harder problems, especially in classes to come after this, what they'll actually do is they'll distribute that pi fourths to both pieces. So before you could know your horizontal shift, you'd have to factor. So yeah, we're not doing that, but you will eventually have to do that one day. So just to note that it does mean multiplication, but that pi fourths is not with this part, right? It's its own piece. Okay? Now let's write our equation for cosine. So it should start out the same way. We always put the A value. What was our A? 3. And then what would I put? Uh-huh. So what comes after sine and cosine? What letter? B. What was our B value? Pi fourths. Uh-huh. And then I need my parentheses for my horizontal shift. What am I going to put for cosine? X minus 3. Good. And then at the very end, I'm going to put plus 2. I won't require that you put this extra set of parentheses if you don't want to have it, but just realize that if they were to factor in that pi fourths, you would have to factor it out, right? It's its own piece. Okay? Okay. All right, let's do another one. Okay, so for number 2, on number 2, looks like they, again, already darkened the line for us so that we would be able to see what our K value is. So that's good. We will be able to tell if we would get it right or not. So remember, if I'm using the formula from the front page, if they had not darkened that line for me, I would do a maximum and a minimum. Well, where is that maximum point at? 1. And where's that minimum at? I think 7. Yeah, 7. Okay. So for my amplitude, remember it's the absolute value of the maximum, which you guys said was 1, minus the minimum, which you guys said was -7, all over 2. All right. Well, minus a negative, like you guys said before, really means to add, right? So 1 plus 7 would give us, and 8 divided by 2 is 4. Okay, so our A value should be 4. And it would appear 1, 2, oh, let's see, I just counted from the wrong line, didn't I? We'd have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. Wait, are we sure that was at 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Am I counting from the right line? 1. Okay. All right. Okay, then for our K value, right? Remember, we said that on the front that your K value would be your maximum minus your amplitude, right? So if I want to find K, K is going to be our maximum, which we said was at 1, right? Minus our amplitude, which is 4. -3. And is that where that darkened line that they drew for us is at? Okay, perfect. Okay, so we found A, we found K. We also need to find B, right? And remember, B is 2 pi divided by the period. And your period is however long it takes for one cycle. So you could go from a 0 to a 0, a maximum to a maximum. We did already highlight this maximum, so I'll go ahead and mark this one. You also could do from a 0 past a maximum and a minimum back to a 0, so that would work too. Either way, we just need to count how far it is between these points. So we got, how far is that going to be between each one? How many lines is that? 6. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, it's 6. Okay, and what would that simplify to, guys? Pi over 3. Okay. All right. Okay, so then for our function, oh, this is in terms of pi, isn't it? I didn't even notice that compared to our last graph. Okay, so it is 6 lines over, but that's going to change this just a little bit. 6 lines over looks like on our graph, 1, 2, every 3 lines is pi halves, right? So 6 lines would be how far? Pi, yeah. So that's a pi in the bottom. 6 lines is equivalent to pi. All right, so that's going to simplify and give us a b value of 2. Okay, so we found a, we found k, we found b. The only thing left is h, and remember, h could be different for sine versus cosine because they don't start at the same place, all right? Okay, so for sine, remember that always starts on the y-axis, right? So that would be on this line right here. Does it look like my 0, 0 has moved off of that line? No, it's still right here, right? It has not moved left or right any. Okay, so then for my sines h, we're saying there is not one, right? It hasn't moved left or right any. Okay, but for cosines h, it should also be on this line, but it's over here, right? So how far does it look like that one moved over? Pi fourths, right? Because it's 1.5 spaces over, okay? And it moved to the right, so I'll put x minus pi fourths. Very good. Okay, so now we have everything we need to write our equations. So we'll start with sine. Y equals, what do I put first? A, the 4, followed by sine, and then what comes next in the equation? The 2, your b value. And then I'll put my x, right? Do I have to add or subtract anything to that x value? Okay. And then what are we going to use for k? -3. Okay. Now let's do cosine's equation. What does it start with? 4, followed by cosine. What do we put? 2 for our b value. And then, very good. And then -3 on the end. All right. Okay,